Hi, everyone. Before the episode begins, I just want to remind you to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Marlene the Plant Lady and YouTube, Everything Gardening with Marlene Simon. And remember, please, please, please rate and review on iTunes and Spotify. That just helps the podcast get noticed by more people, and then more people will become better gardeners. And that's what we all want. So enjoy the episode.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. And tonight we are going to talk about tomatoes. He's back. It's Brad Gates, Wild Boar Farms. I love having him on because he is so knowledgeable, so creative. It's when art and science combine, because so many of you know him from Brad's Atomic Grape and Berkeley Tie-Dyed and all the beautiful crazy tomatoes, beautiful and tasty tomatoes out there on the market. And so he's joining me. He's taking time out from the busy tomato season. And thanks, Brad. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Marlene. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, I see you're posting some beautiful tomatoes, but you're always looking for the next best tomato. So what's out on the horizon? What's exciting? What's interesting you? And what are you going to have on the market soon?
So yeah, a few different things. I guess one of the things I'm really excited about is I have a new cherry tomato that I've been working on, and it kind of resembles it's gold like a sun gold or whatever,
Mhm.
but everybody that I let taste this says it actually tastes better than sun gold, which is kind of has a very high bar. So I know sun gold's great, it's sweetie and fruit, and what people are saying is this also has like a true tomato flavor to go with it. So I'm looking forward to that one, and it's actually kind of has an interesting history. A person by the name of Tim Peters in the '90s, kind of ahead of his time, was crossing domesticated tomatoes with some wild ones, and then it ended up in the hands of another person, ended up with some seeds, and 17 years later got several of them to germinate, and then she came down and let me try some and gave me some at the Heirloom Expo. I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago. So it was a mixed phenotype from a cross way back in the '90s, and then I got to play with it for 6 or 7 generations and found just this beautiful orange, kind of a small cherry tomato, but the flavor is just mind blowing.
I can't wait to taste it because, I mean, your tomatoes are, phenomenal, but sun golds, hands down, they always, blind taste tests, they always tend to come out pretty high up. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm going to be very excited to try that. I know also the one that's out now that I've just been seeing crazy pictures of. Is it the Chardonnay, or what is it? The big clusters of sort of that
Oh,
yellow.
the berries crazy cherry.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, that one is just it's just so good all the way around. And I know so many people said I saw the picture and I thought no way, and then they grew it and were like yes way.
Yeah, I
But
have
it's
it,
just
and it's very tasty. It's tasty, because sometimes you're like, with certain things when they produce so much, but it's a tasty one.
yeah, that's you can have your cake and eat it too
Mhm.
variety, I think. Yeah, produces good. They're very durable too. They'll hang on the vine for a week or two without going bad, another bonus. And then yeah, nothing matters if it doesn't taste really good.
Yeah, I just remembered, I don't know if I ever talked about how a few years back, I was helping you harvest your tomatoes. I'm like, "Oh, he was on my podcast, so the only thing I could do is go out and help him," and of course, it's fun and interesting, but everyone who was there, you were sort of training us to look for unusual ones on it. Like, we were looking for the ones that had interesting stripage or colors, and it was sort of fun. It was like, I got this one. It was like we're running up to the teacher and trying to like impress the teacher. Like, look at
Yeah.
this one. Look what one I found.
Yeah, I do remember that, and that actually did spawn some interesting things that I'm working on. And if you remember, a lot of those were really nice, like medium size and really smooth skin, oval, beautiful tomatoes. And been putting some work into those because they have a more reliable harvest. For one, that they look good and they taste good, but the small to medium sized tomatoes tend to, in general, give you a more reliable harvest. So I'm working on some lines from some of those that, no matter what the conditions, they give you handfuls of tomatoes.
And actually, that's a great segue to one of the big common complaints that I'm sure you get and I get. Well, I don't know if people ask you, I'm sure they ask you tomato questions in general, not just about your tomatoes, but I'm constantly getting, oh, why is my fruit not setting? And as soon as I found out it's a large fruiting one, an heirloom large fruiting one, it's true that the larger varieties tend not to produce as much fruit. Is that just overall universal?
Yeah, I would say definitely the larger tomatoes are more picky. Your blooms cannot set if it's too cold, it's too dry, it's too hot. Sometimes it seems to be no reason at all. So yeah, a lot of times tapping the blooms does help a lot. It increases the pollination. And then another thing, some of them, even under ideal conditions of big tomatoes, you might start off with 10 flowers in a cluster, but the plant will set between one and three of those because they're fist sized tomatoes. So even at only setting, say, 20% of your blooms turn into fruit, that actually ends up a very bountiful harvest. So sometimes people don't account for that too.
Yeah, I always say it's sort of almost more like a weight thing than a fruit thing. You have so much energy and sugar going into one versus a whole bunch of tiny little cherry tomatoes. So it's what the plant could handle,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. A lot of times they can sense things are right or wrong, and yeah, abort flowers because of that.
Did you find that tomatoes were setting a little bit later this year because we had that unusual cold spell? I mean, it seemed like the tomatoes made it through okay as far as, looking at the tomatoes, but did you notice that the plants themselves were set back and then the fruit set was set back a little bit?
Yeah, I would say we definitely the first 2 months, all of April and all of May were pretty rough weather, so we definitely lost, I would say, weeks of potential grow time from them stalling out. Just an extra cold night, mid to high 30s, lots of wind and things like that. So definitely a delay in this season for that. And then, of course, as soon as that was over, it got extra hot. It stayed hot for a while. So that is one of the, yeah, always diversity in the garden, have from small to large tomatoes, and that ensures your harvest. And then I did notice the larger variety ones were even later. The cherries, they're pulling through. That's what I'm mostly harvesting now, is like my smaller fruited, just starting to get into the larger ones. So yes, it was definitely a delay. We lost at least potentially weeks of growing weather early on.
Well, I'm gonna just sort of brag a little bit because before we started recording, you were saying how you were farming right now in a really challenging spot because it's incredibly windy. There's no wind blocks. The soil was, dries out really fast, pretty hard pan. Um, and the water, well, you just didn't have a lot of water, but I literally lived a few houses down from where you were farming. And I remember that wind. And you were also saying how cold it gets. Yes, I had, and no one believed me, but it is so open out in that area that I had redwoods with frost damage one year. So,
That's, I think, what it is. It's low exposure, and then it's kind of a low spot that you don't notice
uh-huh.
until you spend a little bit of time out there. And with super calm, clear conditions, you don't want to be the lowest spot around because the cold air pools there.
Yeah, I managed to grow fabulous tomatoes because as I tell people, clay soil isn't horrible. You just have to learn how to work it. And before I even planted my first first go round, I made sure I planted, it was like 50 pounds of fava beans, and I had to compost, and I had to heavily mulch. I mean, I had to really heavily mulch so the moisture wasn't pulled out. But I just thought that was funny that here you are, like, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember gardening in those conditions. Yeah, it wasn't easy. Um, so another problem that people are getting right now on their tomatoes, and I personally feel this is more variety specific. I know like blossom end rot is variety can be more variety specific, but I feel like cracking on tomatoes is more and I'll just say because I have your varieties at my house and they're not cracking. And I have some other varieties um, and they're cracking. So it's like, well, same exact moisture. And I know there's always, gradients even from plant to plant and soil moisture and everything and exposure. But I really think cracking is variety specific. But why do they crack? What happens there when they split?
Usually it is the interior is growing faster than the skin. So typically it's if the plant, same thing that kind of locks up calcium, getting it pretty dry and then realizing you should have watered a day or two ago and then watering a whole bunch to make up for it. So going from dry where the plant is kind of struggling to make it has to really earn its moisture to form a tomato, and then suddenly there's an abundance of moisture. It just takes in too much too fast, and with a lot of heirlooms the skin is pretty thin on them, which can kind of makes them a delicacy when you're eating them, but they can become a little bit of a problem while you're growing them. So it's typically just the insides growing faster than the skin can grow, and it's usually because of a big uptake of moisture. At least we can. It's usually our fault when we have it here in California. Some people, when they get rain during the summer, it can be unavoidable unless you're like covering your plants so that you can manipulate the moisture during the summer from the rains.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is it's still my fault.
So, it's actually, I mean, really, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Just like blossom and rot, sometimes
Yeah.
it creeps in. You think you did everything right or whatever. Um, yeah, I always figure if there's small little cracks and they're not oozing out of the skin, it's a fully good tomato. And even if it is, that just means the clock's ticking and you have a short amount of time to consume it.
Yeah, yeah. No, uh, yeah, it's happened on a few of mine, and it's sorta like, the blossom end rot thing, and if people follow me on Facebook and Instagram, they know I'm gonna be dying on my deathbed. I'm still gonna be trying to debunk the blossom end rot myths, but it's true, even if you do everything correct, and I will say this year, I think I had 1 tomato with blossom end rot. Last year, a lot. And last year was it was probably the worst year for tomatoes I've ever experienced. Worst year of a garden my father-in-law, who's been gardening forever, has experienced. I think it was just so hot. We had a lot of smoke from fires and um but yeah, blossom end rot. Would you like to give your 2 cents on blossom end rot? Just
So it's a calcium deficiency, and calcium seems to be a little tricky with tomatoes. And I think the fruit in the last week or two of its development has a huge demand of calcium. So once again, calcium can be abundant in your soil, but if it's too hot, too cold, or too wet, it can inhibit the uptake of that calcium. So then again, trying to keep in the an even watering cycle can help with that. Early in the season, it's more common. Paste and Roma tomatoes, it can be more common. If you're lucky, you have it on the first few tomatoes and then it disappears.
mhm.
Obviously, it always hurts when it's the first tomatoes in the garden you think are ripe, and then they're only a half a tomato, or they have that sunken spot in the bottom of them. So
Yeah, you just cut that off and eat it and still say, "Wow, look at my first tomato."
yeah, flip it the other way and take the picture.
Exactly. You're like, "Look at this perfect tomato, everyone." Oh. What
So
is
it is good, and as long as it's not a chronic problem throughout the season, then you're really
yeah.
doing something wrong, or you need to change the variety. Typically, if you only I feel like if you say even lost 20% of the beginning of your fruit or something, and then the rest came out, then you're doing good overall.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see why Romas are so susceptible, and I'm wondering if what it is about them. It almost seems like they have less moisture in them, and since I'm wondering if that's has to do with in calcium uptake and calcium. I don't know. It just that's the
Well, that's
only.
an interesting theory for sure. Yeah, I wonder, is their vascular system not as good? Is their
Mm-hmm.
calcium demand? Is their calcium demand more? That's
Yeah,
yeah, interesting.
or if it doesn't, because it moves in the no, it actually I think it moves in the xylem, which is the water transport. I'm trying to remember all this stuff. Anyways, I'm gonna have to come up with my own theory about
I
that.
have to look into it
Yeah, I
more
have to
now.
look
Yeah.
into that. Yeah, but, my big thing is debunking is, like, don't spray, calcium doesn't move. It only moves from the soil up through the roots to the plant one direction, it won't be taken
That
up by
that
the
is good to
tomato.
point out. They have calcium sprays, and I
Ugh,
mean it might work for like a leaf crop or something, but it definitely the calcium does not transfer from your tomato plant
mhm,
that way. So
mhm. So, have you ever gotten, any of your soil tested before you plant, or do you just sort of I mean, what I do is I was talking to someone who's a flower farmer up in, Mendocino. It's a Mendocino Botanic Garden, so it's very possible this is just their routine, but I've always sort of told people, "Oh, don't bother, like, getting your soil tested," especially if you have clay soils. They're highly, nutritious, nutrient rich, and if you add compost and do all the right things before you plant, um, you're probably not gonna be lacking anything. Your pH is probably not gonna be ideal, especially in this area. But have you ever found that you were like, "Hmm, I need to go get soil tested," or have you just done what I've sort of described?
so I've gone both ways this year. Being in a new site, I definitely wish I would have had a soil test. I feel like something's off more than usual and causing like lack of nutrient uptake. But
Hmm,
we're kind of lucky, and most of the Sacramento Valley has decent to good soil, especially the structure and everything. So by adding compost and organic nutrients and using good water, typically you can get really good results. Probably not everybody's in that kind of a situation. And one thing I find too is maybe having your water tested can be an issue too. I find with some
mhm.
gardens. Um, So hardness or pH off, or there can even be certain salts and stuff in water if you're getting it from a well. So that also can be a possibility if you're having some sort of problems. The money for a soil test could be worth it, and then also a water test, especially if that's your main grow area and you're not going anywhere for a little while. That would be time, money, and energy well spent
Y
if you're having an issue. If
y
you're not, then keep doing the
Yeah,
same thing.
exactly. Yeah, don't mess with it. Don't even change anything. That's what's always funny is people like, "Oh, I'm gonna be adding this. Oh, I heard it was good." It's like, you're if what you're doing is working, that's great. We know at the end of the season, you need to replenish the nutrients you took out, but usually just by adding compost, into it is gonna help and maybe a little manure for nitrogen because that one is such a large macronutrient. But it's sometimes I think people forget that if you add too much of one thing, hoping to get better results, it actually then binds and messes with the availability of the other nutrients. So they all work together. So I think some people are like, well, I'm just going to add this. I mean, you hear it with the Epsom salts, and Epsom salts is magnesium. So if you're not lacking it, you definitely don't want to add more magnesium because it could throw off, I think it's potassium uptake. I could be wrong with that. Um,
Yeah, it locks up. It could lock up all kinds of things for
mhm.
sure. So, yeah, that's why I like in general the basic two times or more a year of say a 1 to 4 inch layer of quality compost, and then if that's still not enough, manipulating it a little bit with like some sort of good organic, like a pelletized or granular fertilizer. Between those two, you should be able to obtain all the soil health that you need in most situations.
Did you find that you were because you normally you stop fertilizing when you get a good, healthy, established plant, if you fertilize at all, but it does help a little bit. Did you notice because of the soil you were at, you were fertilizing longer or needed to?
Yeah, just because of the lack of the, it was kind of a last minute change of the location. I thought I could make it work. In hindsight, it didn't work that well.
Mhm.
But yeah, adding organic matter initially in larger amounts, I think would have helped a lot because the organic matter is what holds moisture. It holds nutrients. Without it, it's harder for then you're just basically have dirt, not soil, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Okay. Yeah, and you mentioned water, now I'm like, it's where I lived before, right, you said the well that you're running off is 150 feet. We had a ag well that was 800 feet, and the water was absolutely beautiful. With where I'm at now, the well is only 90 feet deep, and literally it smokes when I take it out of the faucet. It is so cloudy. Of course, we don't drink it. We don't cook with it. We do bathe in it, but it's so harsh in so many, if I put a hose on a hose bib, within, a few weeks, the calcium is just seized it up. And I never really thought tomatoes were so picky about pH and all that, but, there's obviously more going on. It's really high alkaline. So, I'm just wondering if if tomatoes are, a little more picky about pH than I originally thought. Um,
I would say compared to they have more of a variance acceptability than say probably the average garden plant, but
mhm.
there's still parameters on that. So, and then I guess the good thing about the good news is you have water just 90 feet below your property that's available. But yeah, you're probably a lot more dissolved minerals and everything else in that top layer, maybe than opposed to the deeper well.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think I'd rather take pure water and have to add stuff to it than this water. But how many varieties are you growing this year out?
Um, so I had two sections. I have about 1,200 plants that have about 20 or 25 varieties that are already developed varieties that I'm trying to up my seed supply. And
Okay.
then I actually have about 1,000 plants of several dozen different phenotypes that are works in progress and trials and stuff because um, you're about 5 to 7 years or more into generations or seasons into a single variety. So I'm constantly growing out dozens and dozens of those, taking one step at a time, basically.
Yeah, and we talked about this last time you were on the podcast, how your whole process is, but just to because it is so fascinating. People might think, "Oh, you just find this tomato that looks really awesome and cool. You collect the seeds and you sell the seeds." That's not what happens. You're trying to build stability, and it takes what, 5 no, more than that. How many generations?
So usually at least five if you're lucky in selecting some recessive traits, but it's typically about 7 or 8 generations. So yeah, each generation you're getting a little closer to stability on what you're looking for. And then there's all kinds of beautiful tomato variations that come out of those crosses that will sidetrack you or actually start other projects too. So yeah, you're trying to select when you make a cross originally, or if Mother Nature even does it, you want to grow out as many plants as you can. It's better if you can at least grow, say, a couple dozen of a cross just to be able to evaluate its potential of what it's going to possibly provide. And then you need to select basically the exact same tomato out of it might spit out a bunch of variations, but you have to find that variation that resembled the one that you chose the year before. And so
Mhm.
if you keep picking the exact same traits, size, flavor, coloring, growth habitat, and you do that for 5 to 8 years, then all of your seeds actually grow true. So it starts off as a hybrid and then you dehybridize it into an open pollinated form, which open pollinated means you can save the seeds and grow them again next year. And that's what our open pollinated varieties.
Was Brad's Atomic Grape, was that a wild? Was that just a chance, or did you purposely cross that? Was that
That
yours?
was actually, yeah, that was a cross that happened in the garden, and then I was looking for something else, and that popped out in the third generation. So that was a sidetrack basically, where you're say you're I always kind of I'll do it. You take a basketball and a football and they cross, and then you end up with a softball, and then you're like, okay, cool, I'm gonna create a softball, and then the next generation, maybe a tennis ball shows up, or a foosball, or all these other potentially good variants of a tomato, and then that you start from there and start over. So as you're selecting and breeding, there's other variants that are showing up that and really that's where I ended up getting a lot of my best stuff, is just letting nature show off, kind of, especially when you make across the first generation. They can be kind of okay looking or
Mhm.
whatever, and then the F2 and the F3 is where the genetics select, they start to sort. So you might have actually crossed, say, a small orange cherry tomato, you used it for a parent, but you didn't know it had a great 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 grandparent that was a red beefsteak or something. So some of these other um, traits that are within the DNA will show up, especially in like the F2 and F3. That's when they really want to sort out, and Mother Nature's actually trying to test all the examples that she can to see what's successful and what's not.
Yeah, it's a pretty real one, it's a very patient process, and 2, you have to be very organized, 2 things that I'm not on either end, so
I'm not sure I did it, but it taught me some patience, organization. Well,
yeah, you better
I'm
be
just
organized, you gotta keep all these seeds straight from,
yeah,
um
basic notes and lots of pictures.
yeah,
Actually, that's my two best friends, because I'm not so good with so much writing. So I do a medium amount of writing. I will give it a name, a working name in my head, and take pictures. And then I kind of categorize in my head sometimes, like, okay, yeah, I remember this was the flavor I'm looking for. I'll have basic notes in that picture, and then a nickname, and all those kind of come together where I can stay on the path of one variety. Like I said, you might get sidetracked and
mhm,
spawn some other ones, but one of the main things, if you want to develop an open pollinated variety, is you have to do the exact same thing for quite a few generations.
yeah, yeah, um, one thing is, so say you find, very beautiful tomato out in the field, and you go and you eat it, and it's not very tasty. It's not to say you won't give up on that, because then if you plant it the following year, you might get the same traits of it being beautiful with better flavor, or do you just always let flavor, if something's not flavorful right off the bat, even if it's beautiful, would you give up on it? Or
I've gone both ways. So usually in some of the crosses, you're always going to have some bad tasting, or even ones that you like spit out instantly. There's some interesting textures, flavors, astringentness,
Mhm.
um, almost like eating cotton dry. I've tasted just about every bad trait to go with the good. So yes, I usually went for the most flavor. It had to be beautiful and then had to have flavor. If you have enough time and can grow enough plants, you can find the chosen ones out of there that you will usually find, unless it's a really bad cross for some reason. You'll find some characteristics that are very good and worth carrying forward. So actually, when the purple blue anthocyanin trait came around,
Mhm.
the original parent was literally like unedible. And so that one, actually, I was in it three generations of crossing, and had grown out thousands of plants before I started finding good to decent flavor. And then from there, it actually, now a lot of them are my favorite to eat. I think they'll rival any other tomato or
Mhm.
whatever. But that one was definitely finicky for the first couple of generations, and I had to grow out a lot of plants and make some choice selections to find the ones that had the best flavor.
Okay, so I think, like, a trait like that would is so just different and beautiful with that dark anthocyanin, yeah, I imagine. That
I had to make it work.
yeah, you
It's
had to
like,
make it
this is
work.
so captivating, and it even would have been okay as being a moderate or reasonably edible tomato. It just wouldn't have been as good
Uh-huh.
if you can make it highly edible. Because yeah, it was always, even when it was mediocre tasting, some of the early ones you couldn't walk by it without stopping and looking.
Yeah, yeah. Have you given up just on some? Like, gone, "Forget it, I'm not bothering with you
Yeah,
anymore?"
definitely. There was an early on cross. I did Brad's Atomic Grape and Pink Boar, or not, Evan's Purple Pear and Pink Boar. This is going back 10 or 15 years ago, and they're
Mhm.
both really good varieties. And then they were crossed, and then I grew out the crosses. They're all early and beautiful and almost had like a fake shine to them.
Mm.
And I was so happy. And there was uh 20, 30 different variations I ended up with, and they were all spitters. I just threw in the towel right then. I didn't It was so weird. And then there's other one of the crosses I'm working on now is the blue boarberry and the Brad's Atomic Grape, and that's actually shown to be the opposite. There hasn't really been a spitter in the pile. They're all good to great. So yeah,
Wow.
they can go either way. So I figure if you have a smaller amount of space, best to try to stick with the better flavors. If you had more space to play around, you could get highly edible in the design or package of a tomato that you're looking for.
Now, are you the only taste tester? Do you rely solely on yourself, or do you, disseminate them out to different people to see what their opinion is on the taste?
Definitely a lot of people. I've
Okay.
burned a flat spot on my tongue like many times during the summer tasting. And then I used to trick people to come out like, hey, I need to taste like all the tomatoes you can eat, and I'm looking for the good ones. And then they get out there and say, okay, here's 2 rows of 100 plants, and we're only going to pick like 3 of them. So go out there and taste all 200, and tell me which ones are the best. And so part of it was that it was kind of, I'd have farmers market customers give me feedback. I would have chefs that I was dealing with come out and tour the garden, and we would go down rows, tasting, spitting, throwing them over our shoulders. I specifically remember one time there was only a couple tomatoes left on a plant, and we both were going through just kind of taking bites and throwing them. And we both took a bite and took a couple of steps, and we'd both thrown it on the ground and turned around and looked at each other like, what? And I remember going back and scooping that tomato off the ground and getting the dirt off of it and saving the seeds. So
Uh,
yeah.
okay, good. I was just wasn't sure if you're out there like, "I don't like this, so I'm not gonna grow it." I mean, that's, what that's human nature. It's like, "I like this flower,
That
I'm
is
growing this
true.
flower."
And then I think I developed my tomato loving flavors came from, I guess, what everybody else was liking also. So it made it easy. I guess everybody has a different flavor taste. They might think it's good, might think it's bad, but then when more people are really impressed with it, then it's good. I
Yeah.
always say you could take the best wine in the world and give it to 10 people, and probably only 5 of them would like it if you're lucky.
Yeah, I would be like, "I like that one." They're like, "That was the cheapest one." I'm like, "Okay." All
That
right.
works out easy.
Uh-huh. Okay, I'm gonna ask you something because it just popped in my mind, and I'm not sure if you'll I'm just throwing I'm sure you'll know, but so I bought a variegated tomato this year just because it was variegated, and I'm like, "I'm gonna grow a variegated tomato." We have a student who works in, one of our UC Davis students. He's doing some tomato research, and he goes out into the field, and he came back with the most fabulously beautiful variegated tomato that just popped up. I mean, the variegation is just, and I know that a lot of variegations are from viruses, but this didn't look like your standard tomato virus, which I usually think of as tomato mosaic virus, which is look like concentric circles and marbling on the fruit and also the leaves. Do you know anything about like, is it a virus? Is that a virus tomato, or is that a just a spontaneous mutation? Or
So I have seen it pop up. I've had it pop up on certain things. And then as I did, someone pointed out that it was a virus. And from the research I did, it might be a virus or that plant is susceptible to it, but it doesn't. I've grown lots of varieties and I've never seen it spread to another variety,
Mhm.
that doesn't have the genetics for the variegation. So I'm not exactly sure how that works.
Okay.
I've found three or four at least over the years, and most of them, none of them ever came true to seeds. I went three generations into like a beautiful variegated mortgage lifter that I found. And
Ooh.
after three, I grew like 75 plants, 72 plants from the seeds. None of them showed variegation. I saved seeds from a bunch of those and tried again, and it never showed up. Actually, my mom had a Berkeley tie-dye show up with variegation, and some of the fruit were almost like ghostly white,
Ooh.
and most of them had sterile seeds in them, the ones that had too much variegation. And then I had one beautiful tomato that did sprout, and about 20 or 30% of those seeds, um, just I called them the ghosts. They came up white with just a pale amount of purple and never produced past the cotyledon leaves. They never produced any chlorophyll. So they actually sat there for like 3 months old, just 1 inch tall with the original leaves on them. So, and then I've had somebody else send me a variety that has been, I don't know if it was from selection or how, but it did breed true for
Hmm.
variegation. And then we made some crosses on that. And then through some selection, that one did breed out. So the ones that I've found originally, I had no success reproducing it. There are a couple varieties that people have had success by capturing, making it into an open pollinated form. And like I said, like you said, I have heard it referred to as a disease, and I kind of went down the rabbit hole just learning about it and stuff. But as far as I can tell, it might be like susceptible to that variegation. But like I said, I've grown it in my garden a bunch of times. I've never seen it show up like on another plant or in another row or spread or anything.
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely not a virus trait that I've seen in tomatoes, but not to say that I've seen all of them.
Yeah, they
It
can still be completely healthy. Sometimes
Uh-huh.
when it gets too much of the variegation,
Yeah.
it'll turn weak because it
Mhm.
needs some chlorophyll. So the right amount of like 2/3 chlorophyll leaf, 1/3 variegation seems to be the happy medium where I've had beautiful plants, that were still completely healthy looking that had the variegation. And one of the things that the trait seems to do, even when it does come true to the seeds, is um, after it gets hot, it tends to disappear. It likes cooler weather more
That
for whatever
Oh, that
reason.
yeah, that probably makes sense if it's just not adapted to the heat. Yeah, it's
What
sort
you
of
could do is take a cutting of it and keep it
Mhm.
alive if it was unique enough,
Mhm.
or if it was a pretty plant that was producing nice fruit. One of the ways you could do it is to take a cutting and keep it alive that way. I actually did that with one of the Berkeley tie dyes, but then after months of taking care of it in the winter,
Yeah.
I skipped one beat and it was
Yeah,
dead. So
yeah, yeah. Right now it's in our hydroponics cloner, and I just saw it
it makes
today,
it okay.
and I'm
Okay,
like,
yeah, that's definitely one way. Was
e
it a tomato? Is that what you said, or was it like a regular the field Roma tomato, or what was it?
I should ask him where it's research tomato, so I know they're probably not using anything besides sort of maybe just determinate, whatever tomatoes they use for, I should ask him, but because the one I have is one, it's not setting fruit yet, and it's growing out of its variegation. That's the other thing. If you don't even the plants like we
Yeah,
have, like
they don't like the heat.
Mhm.
Actually, is for sure. So
Yeah, and whether yeah, that's pretty amazing that you got the fruit to actually be a different color. Because a lot of times I think it was, I asked Don Shore, Redwood Barn Nursery, and I'm like, "Do you know what the fruit is?" And he's like, "Every once in a while, you might get a variegated fruit off of it or something, different colored fruit, but so far nothing." But it was just one of those things. I'm like, "It might look pretty along with these flowers right here." But this
yeah,
variegation the student got, I was just like, that's spectacular variegation. I mean, it had almost like
yeah, the leaves are
ruffly
pretty,
leaves.
and
Yeah.
yeah, like you're saying, the fruit. I've only seen it that one time. It was on that one Berkeley tie dye my mom had. All the other variegations, there's no variegation in the fruit, but the sepals will have really nice variegation on them, making them
Mm.
look kind of cool.
No, that's pretty. Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of colorization, because you were talking about said something about, oh, the leaf things this is, early on in the season, people sort of freak out about their tomato leaves turning purple. And I even saw some things where people are like, "Oh, it's usually when your leaves turn purple, it's a lot lack of phosphorus." Um
That's what they always say. Yeah.
yeah, but it's not, right? I mean, that's just them adjusting. It could be a
Well,
little cold.
it it could, and then even some of the anthocyanin varieties,
Mhm.
the gene is actually it's in two places. One's in the plant and one's in the fruit. So um, even good or any kind of stress conditions, for sure, you can get purpling in the plant that way. You shouldn't have, if it's not an anthocyanin variety, you shouldn't have too much purpling in, like, say, the growing third of your plant. That's where I usually look for problems. Even a lot of people always are obsessed about leaf curl. I've actually never seen a tomato plant that didn't have some degree of leaf curl, and especially on the bottom third of the plant. So if you had like some purpling or some leaves that are looking pale or they're really curled up on the bottom third of the plant, it's pretty good chance that it's not a big issue. If you have any of those symptoms on the top third of your plant, there's a pretty good chance that you are having some sort of an issue.
Okay. I was gonna mention curling because it seems to be more problematic the last few years when people are sending me pictures and the leaves are just curled. But I remember almost going through a whole really hot season with the leaves almost curled the whole entire season because it
I
can't.
think that too, the heat. And this year's been plenty warm, but last year we broke records here in the Sacramento Valley. So when you
Mhm.
break heat records in the summer for this area, then that's saying something.
Yeah, and, I'm gonna start even this year, I started shading my peppers, not with anything, they're just I have a walnut orchard right around my vegetable garden, so I have some trees right up against it, so some of them are getting the afternoon shade from the walnut trees, and 2 of my tomatoes are actually getting a little bit of shade from the walnut trees, and I'm sort of eyeing them because I'm like, "You're looking really good." You know? I'm like
In reality, when you're in this 100-degree everyday climate, if you could get behind the trees at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or
Mhm.
something, you'd probably be beneficial.
Yeah.
In the Bay Area, you're looking for the most sun you can get, but once you cross into the Central Valley here, I would say ideally you would have a little afternoon shade, because I was just outside right before I called you, and that after that that late part of that 5 o'clock sun is just painful or whatever. So if I was a plant, I'd love to step into the shade at that point.
Yeah, so I don't know, I'm like, do I start shading some of my peppers? I don't know, I might do a trial next year and just, like, do, like, a 20% shade cloth over some just to see, you know? I mean, I could end up with
Yeah,
beautiful
peppers
plants.
definitely benefit,
Yeah.
and you can also grow sunflowers randomly
Mhm.
in about every, take a big step, plant a sunflower seed, take another big step, plant a sunflower seed, and that will give you approximately a 20 to 30% shading that you can utilize that way also.
It's funny because I posted a video of my garden, and I never think I hardly ever post, like, full pictures of my garden because, like most gardeners, we're like, "It's never perfect. It's never perfect." I'm like, "You
What
could."
brown leaves over there? No.
Yeah, I'm like, "You could come inside my dirty house, that's fine. You just can't see my imperfect." It took me a while for that, but I did a video. I'm like, "You know what? Whatever." And I have a lot of sunflowers planted, and someone, sent me a question, and I don't wanna, like, make fun of anyone, of course, but I was like they're like, "Oh, I saw your picture. I heard that sunflowers, though, inhibit growth of plants around them." And I wanted to write back, does it look like any of my plants are stunted? How big do you want these squash plants to be? Um, so yeah, I'm glad you said that because no, they do not stunt your plants. Maybe if something needs, 20 hours of sun, and it's given a little bit of shade, but no, it's so weird how people. I'll never stop hearing these myths that people are hearing. So it's good to hear you say use sunflowers to help shade. So
Yeah, I would assume they were worried about, like, some plants will, like, put something through their roots and actually even walnut trees put out like a tannin or whatever to fight off competition. But as far as I know, that doesn't happen with sunflowers, because you have for beauty and function in my gardens all the times, and I've never seen any bad growth around them.
yeah, well, what's funny is I'm actually literally planting right up against walnut trees. And so these are English walnuts, and it's actually, I think, just the black walnuts, and it's the junglins, junglaceae, I think is the chemical, and I think it breaks down pretty fast, but, you know, so I think I'm safe but I don't know, these English walnuts might be grafted onto black walnut roots.
Yeah, they
So,
definitely are.
but
But you have raised beds though, so you have a different than you're not.
no.
If you were in
Uh,
okay.
these are right next. They're the 2 ones that are in the shade of the walnut tree that are looking the happiest and healthiest because I get that shade, are probably, I wanna say maybe 10 feet away from the trunk of that walnut tree.
Well, there
So
goes all the there goes that theory there.
so,
That's
yeah, I'm
that's
gonna take a picture of
why it's
that.
good in the gardening world. If someone tells you no, just say yes and try it,
Yeah.
because it might actually work.
So I mean, like, I'm trying it. I mean, it's like I even have a true black walnut that I'm growing stuff under, and but yeah, I mean, there's definitely chemicals that are, there's a term, alleliopathic chemicals, and that's why you don't want grass growing right up your tree. But it's like some of these that, I don't think sunflowers have any major. Yeah, I don't know where that one's coming from,
Yeah, to the
but
best of my knowledge, they don't. I haven't seen it myself, and
yeah.
yeah, they can actually, as far as fast as they grow and as basically cheap as the seeds are and what you get out of them.
Mhm.
That's always been one of my favorite ones for adding some shade or beauty in the
Mhm.
garden. Plus, you feed the birds and whatever else too.
Yeah, yeah. So I like to intersperse flowers in with all my. Sometimes I wonder if I'm even like a vegetable gardener because I'm like, "Oh, I wanna put that flower there. I wanna put that flower," and then there's like spot for one vegetable plant. Like, um, so another problem that might be going on with people, and it could be, they're just a little impatient, but it feels like their tomatoes aren't turning red. What's going on
Yeah,
there?
that it's the calm before the storm, I
Yeah.
think typically is what it is. And it's sometimes they do seem to go into a stall. If you have cold nights at all, it can really stall them. So if you're attached to the Bay Area, say from Fairfield towards the coast, my parents live in Napa. They've been having really nice weather as far as cool, mostly well into the low to mid 50s at night or whatever. That can really slow them down. Sometimes it's like the watch pot that never boils
Mhm.
effect. I think
Mhm.
you're just hoping for it and waiting so much. And if you're really worried about it, you start cutting back if the plant's nice and healthy. If you want to start reducing water by on the average 20 to 30% when you just about to start picking, just for the best quality of tomatoes and less cracking and better flavor. So cutting back a little bit on the water right when you have a bunch of green fruit hanging there about to start turning could a give you quicker fruit and b give you better quality fruit when it comes ripe. So that's one way of speeding it up.
Okay, that's a good tip. I like that.
The sign of stress, if the plant has just a little bit of stress, it's like, maybe not every day is going to be a perfect day, and maybe maybe I better get my butt going, so to speak. They can kind of lollygag if they're really happy. And overall, if you get a little bit of delay but you have an extra healthy plant, it's usually worth it in the long run. You might miss out on a couple weeks of eating early on, but the plant will give you so much more fruit and possibly late into the season. So it's a good trade-off. And if you're really worried about early tomatoes, grow in containers or grow a small area in the ground and neglect them overall, and you will get tomatoes quicker that way too, because the plant really does have a sensing mechanism. Its whole goal is to produce a seed, and it has to produce a ripe fruit to do that. So if it's height of summer right now, lots of food, good amount of water, it's like, we got plenty of time, we're just going to take our time or whatever. But then if the water starts to get cut back a little bit or certain elements happen, it can be like, maybe summer's not going to last forever. Maybe we better start producing some ripe fruit here.
Yeah, so that's what we use sometimes, like, if you're trying to get something to flower, because it's, like, especially like an annual, it's like not flowering. You're like, stress a little bit, make it realize its time is limited and it has to be on this earth to do what it was put on this earth to do, which is reproduce, which if that was
Yeah,
my
and it
purpose,
is
then I
true.
failed. But
during the drought times, there's certain bushes that just bloom like crazy. I've noticed in the spring, and I feel like it's a little bit of an act of desperation. They're wanting to try to make more viable seeds, thinking it might not be a great time.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, it's just funny that you're mentioning temperatures and stuff because another thing you read all the time is, oh, well, tomatoes won't set fruit if it's above 90 degrees. And I always like, as I'm like thinking of that, I'm driving by Central Valley tomatoes in the field. That's where we plant them. We would not
And
have
think,
any tomatoes in the Central Valley if they did not set above 90 degrees. I know heat stress could knock flower buds off for sure. Um,
yeah,
but it takes a lot. I mean, I don't add extra water. I don't go out and go, oh, it's going to be 105 today versus say 95. I keep my watering schedule pretty darn even. Um, and they seem to handle those temperatures. I might, of course, lose some flowers, but that's for the benefit of the plant. It's like, hey, I'm not gonna set right now.
yep, very true. And then yeah, that's all. Like I said, I always say diversify your plants, the varieties and the size or whatever too, so that the cherry tomatoes, the smaller ones, are always more determined to give you fruit. They'll almost always be your early fruit. That'll almost be like, oh, we had historic heat wave. I still have some fruit.
Hmm.
And so yeah.
So, how was this? I know we talked and you know, talking to a lot of nursery owners. Since the pandemic, it was just crazy. They couldn't keep things in stock. How were your sales this past year? Just as crazy as the previous year?
It's definitely really good. I don't think growing your own food is going out of style. It seems to be getting cooler every day. Yeah, it's definitely good. There was um so the pandemic year, obviously it was crazy and nobody could hardly get plants. And then what happened the year after that, everybody with common sense ran at the earliest time and grabbed their plants and didn't lollygag. So the beginning part of the season was crazy good, but then say like some people that would have planted in May or something, oh no, they got their plants the first week of April, just to ensure or
Mhm.
whatever. And it leveled out a little bit more as far as people knew they could reliably go to the store and they could reliably pick up some tomato plants. So the season was definitely very good, but it evened back out into where it's you know, 2 months or more of tomato plant sowing and planting time. And yeah, it's one of the coolest things you can do for lots of reasons anyways, is grow your own food. And yeah, it's not getting any uncooler.
Yeah, yeah, no, and so where can people find your seeds that you sell?
I sell them on my website, wildboarfarms.com. Um, that's the number one way.
Yep, buy them direct from you, and then you are
Yeah, yeah.
selling plants next year. You're just because you do starter plants as well.
Yep. We'll have plants all over quite a few nurseries. I'll have a list and everything of who
Okay.
we're hoping to even expand this year, but mainly Northern California, Tomato Mania in Southern California. They buy a bunch of seeds from
Mm,
me and offer a really good selection of Wild Boar Farms varieties. And anybody at every farmer's market across the US that's smart has them. The plants. So it's cool adding new exciting things to the garden. That's what kept me doing it the whole time. That's when I felt like I found my calling, is when I started. These heirloom tomatoes were so weird. You could save your own seeds, and I think what a funny concept that is. I grew up in the F1 hybrid generation, and then when I started saving seeds and having just an occasional unique one show up, and then I started reading, well, this is how all heirlooms originated. Maybe there was somebody in a town or a village or whatever, and they were growing a bunch of red tomatoes, and one plant became yellow, and his wife liked him, and the neighbors liked him, and everybody kept asking for more, and so he
mhm.
started growing more of those, and that's how the evolution of food keeps going. That's one of the exciting things with open pollinated varieties, is you can keep developing unique traits. Some like, you could develop a tomato that likes your cold weather or more of your hot weather, or can acclimate to your climate. And that's something that actually you can't do when you're just buying F1 hybrid seeds.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fun. Like I said, just being out there with the little time I was with you, it's sort of almost like an Easter egg hunt trying to find that golden egg, and
Yeah,
then
it really is. Yeah.
yeah, and then you just realize that wow, this is pretty fun, and then you could eat them too. So that's even a bonus.
Total bonus. Yeah.
well, well,
Flowers are great. Tomatoes are even better.
yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for being on again. I know you're busy. It's like I said, I was like, oh, is he going to even have time? Because it's funny is even though a lot of this information should be talked about off season, because that's when you buy your seeds and you prep your soil and you learn about growing this stuff. But we're human, and when it's happening, that's when we want to hear about it. So
That's true. Yeah.
yeah, it's usually
We're like
happens when
blossom and rod in February.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Usually when someone wants a flower when they see it and they're like, go and try to find it. And it's like, well, no, that should have been planted back in, March and it's blooming now. But yeah, that's just human nature. So I understand.
Well,
Um,
I'll try to get a hold of you possibly next week and have you taste some of these new varieties too, so you can
yeah,
vouch for me.
I live like 5 minutes away from your grow site. So
Okay.
I was gonna say, if you even needed me to go turn water on or do something and you didn't want to drive out, I could do it. I'm right there. So
Geez, I should have realized all this a couple
I
months ago.
know. You're like, here's the key, here's the gas for the weed eater, here's the
Yeah. Here's an extra pair of gloves.
exactly. You're gonna need these trowels and yeah, everything. But no, I mean seriously. Um we'll talk off air about all the logistics of that. But thanks for joining me, and everyone, happy gardening.